My name is Gabriella Wright. I was 34 years old when I stole my own 5-course meal and drove it away in a rented transit van, leaving 50 corporate executives sitting in an empty dining room. It was December 23rd. The temperature in Bismarck, North Dakota was 4 degrees. I stood in the driveway and pushed the heavy latch of a commercial hotbox until it clicked shut. Inside were 50 portions of center-cut beef Wellington, resting at the perfect temperature. Inside the house, my brother-in-law was boasting to his CEO about the premier catering service he hired. He had no idea the catering service was currently turning the ignition key and merging onto Interstate 94. What happened next cost him his job, forced my family out of their home, and proved exactly who owned the ground they were standing on. Welcome back to Pana Vengeance. Before we get to the invoice that changed everything, if you have ever poured your own money and sweat into a family obligation only to be treated like the hired help, take a second to hit subscribe. Drop a comment with your age and let me know you are listening. To understand how we ended up in that driveway, I need to take you back 28 days to Thanksgiving morning. I manage a commercial kitchen for a regional hospital network. I oversee a staff of 20 and feed 500 patients daily. I command a professional workspace. But inside my late grandmother's house, I was treated as an unpaid scullery maid. The kitchen was 90 degrees. The air was heavy with the smell of rendered turkey fat, bruised sage, and reducing wine. I had been standing on the cracked linoleum since 4 in the morning. Out in the living room, 30 people were drinking wine and laughing. Aunts, uncles, my mother's social circle, and neighbors she wanted to impress. I had funded the entire grocery run from my own savings account, $600 in provisions, executed over a 48-hour marathon of solitary labor. The swinging door pushed open. My mother, Evelyn, stepped into the kitchen. She wore an imported cashmere sweater and held a half-empty wine glass. She bypassed the resting turkey and the intricate side dishes, stopping at the stove. She dipped a spoon into the saucepan of pan-dripping gravy, tasted it, and clicked her tongue. "It lacks depth, Gabriella. Did you use the boxed stock again?" Before I could answer, she picked up my 8-inch chef knife. It was a high-carbon steel blade I maintained with surgical care, a gift from my grandmother. Evelyn used the tip of it to pry open the packing tape on a cardboard shipping box resting on the counter. Metal ground against adhesive and grit. I stepped forward, took the knife from her hand without a word, wiped the blade down with a clean linen towel, and slid it into my canvas roll. "We sit down in 10 minutes, she said, turning on her heel. "Make sure the serving platters are warm." 10 minutes later, the food was on the table. The dining room looked like a magazine cover. Crystal glasses caught the light. 30 people took their seats. I stood by the kitchen island, untied my stained apron, folded it, and walked toward the dining room doors. Evelyn stepped into the doorway. She placed one hand on the wooden frame physically blocking my path. She looked at my flour-dusted shirt, then looked over her shoulder at the seated guests. "There is no room at the table, Gabriella. Eat in the kitchen. We need you close to clear the plates anyway." I looked past her shoulder. There was an empty chair right next to my sister. Evelyn saw my gaze shift. She widened her stance. "That seat is for Trent's coat," she said. "His suit is custom, and he does not want it wrinkled on the back of a chair. Just fix yourself a plate in here." She pulled the dining room doors shut. The brass latch clicked into place. I stood alone in the heat of the kitchen, listening to the clinking of silverware and the sound of my family eating a feast I paid for while I held a cold dinner roll over the sink. I stood in the center of the kitchen and listened to the brass latch settle into its strike plate. The heavy wooden doors separating me from the dining room muffled the sudden burst of laughter from the guests. I did not knock. I did not ask to be let in. I turned my back to the closed doors and looked at the environment I had spent the last 2 days trying to conquer. The counters were a landscape of copper pots, stained cutting boards, and cooling racks. The air was thick with residual heat. My feet ached inside my non-slip work shoes. At the hospital, I manage a dietary budget of $2 million. Surgeons and department heads step aside when my crew rolls the hot carts down the corridors. I dictate the flow of service. I am the authority. But standing over the porcelain sink in my late grandmother's house, I was just the hired help who forgot her place. I picked up a leftover sourdough roll from a wire rack. I broke it in half. The butter had hardened into a cold, yellow pail. I ate it, leaning over the sink, letting the crumbs fall against the stainless steel drain. Through the thick wood of the doors, the sound of my family echoed. My sister Jessica had a laugh that was designed to be noticed. It was bright, melodic, and constant. Jessica was 28. She was the youngest, the favorite, the one who walked through life expecting doors to open for her. She had never held a job that required an apron. She married Trent 3 years ago. Trent was a regional manager for a Midwestern logistics firm. He favored tailored suits, heavy colognes, and conversations where he was the only one speaking. He viewed the family not as relatives, but as an audience. The swinging door pushed open. Evelyn walked back into the kitchen holding an empty wine decanter. She did not look at me. She walked straight to the wine fridge, pulled out a bottle of Pinot Noir, and reached for the corkscrew. Her movements were sharp, irritated by the inconvenience of having to fetch her own refill. She struggled with the foil cutter. I stepped over, took the bottle from her hands, extracted the cork in one fluid motion, and handed the open bottle back. "You should have left a second bottle on the sideboard," Evelyn said, pouring the dark liquid into her decanter. "I cannot be running back and forth while Trent is entertaining his clients." "I was busy plating the turkey," I said. Evelyn sighed, leaning against the counter. She surveyed the stacks of dirty pans. "Make sure you soak those roasting pans tonight. I do not want to wake up to a dirty kitchen." She took a sip of her wine. Her eyes drifted to the ceiling. "The property taxes on this house are killing me this year. The city raised the assessment again. You should be grateful I let you live here rent-free, Gabriella. Your labor today is the least you can do to contribute to the household." I looked at her. I said nothing. The house belonged to my grandmother. When she passed away 7 years ago, Evelyn moved in and assumed total control. She claimed she held the legal authority to manage the estate. She demanded I cook, clean, and maintain the property as my form of rent. I had accepted this arrangement because fighting Evelyn always resulted in a threat of eviction. Evelyn turned and walked back into the dining room. The door swung shut, leaving me alone with the running faucet. I squeezed a sponge into the hot, soapy water. I began scrubbing the edges of a roasting pan. The repetitive motion usually settled my mind. But then the ambient noise from the dining room shifted. The low murmur of 30 conversations stopped. Someone tapped a knife against a crystal glass. A toast. I turned off the faucet. The water stopped running. I stood perfectly still, listening. Trent's voice boomed through the walls. It carried the practiced cadence of a man giving a keynote presentation. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," Trent said. "When Jessica and I decided to host Thanksgiving this year, I knew we had to pull out all the stops. I told my purveyors I only wanted the finest ingredients: heritage turkey, organic root vegetables, the best wine pairings." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the guests. People ask me, "Trent, how do you find the time to arrange such premier catering while managing the logistics territory?" He paused for polite laughter. I tell them it is all about investing in the right resources. So please raise a glass to good investments, good friends, and a meal worth every penny I spent on it. The sound of 30 crystal glasses clinking together echoed through the house. I stood by the sink, my hands dripping with gray dishwater. I reached into the front pocket of my chef pants. My fingers brushed against a crumpled strip of thermal paper. It was the grocery receipt from the local supplier. $612, paid in full by my personal debit card. Trent did not call any purveyors. Trent did not pay for the heritage bird or the organic vegetables. Trent did not spend 48 hours monitoring oven temperatures. He was claiming my financial sacrifice and my physical labor as his own corporate networking tool. Something fundamental broke inside me at that exact moment. It was not a noisy fracture. It was a silent, permanent realignment. For years, I believed my family was simply demanding and ungrateful. I believed if I just worked harder, cooked better, and stayed out of their way, they would eventually recognize my value. Listening to Trent steal my identity to feed his ego, I realized the truth. They were not demanding. They were parasitic. They viewed me as an appliance, a piece of kitchen equipment that generated luxury on demand. The heat of anger faded, replaced by the cold, clear focus I used when a vendor shorted my hospital order or a freezer failed mid-shift. You do not yell at a broken freezer. You secure the inventory, and you draft a solution. 10 minutes later, Evelyn pushed the swinging door open again. "They are ready for dessert," she said. "Clear the dinner plates first." I dried my hands on a fresh towel. I picked up a large bus tub from the bottom shelf. I pushed through the swinging doors and stepped into the dining room. The air was warm, smelling of expensive perfume and roasted garlic. 30 people sat around the extended mahogany table. Trent was holding court at the head, telling a story about a golf trip. I walked to the first guest, an uncle I had not spoken to in 3 years. I reached over his shoulder and picked up his plate. The porcelain was smeared with cranberry sauce and crumbs. I placed it quietly into the gray plastic tub. I moved down the line, plate after plate, scraping bones and half-eaten vegetables. No one stopped their conversation. No one looked up to say thank you. I was a ghost in my own home. I reached Jessica. She was wearing a silk blouse. She did not turn her head to acknowledge me. She simply lifted her plate an inch off the table, expecting me to take it from her hand. I took it. I reached Trent. He was mid-sentence. He held his plate out to the side without breaking eye contact with his CEO sitting across the table. I took the plate. I carried 30 dirty plates back into the kitchen. I set the heavy tub onto the counter. I looked at the crumpled receipt resting near the sink. The resentment was no longer a heavy weight. It was a sharpening stone. Tomorrow morning the house would be quiet. The guests would be gone, and I would ask my mother about the $600 Trent claimed he spent. I knew she would defend him. I was counting on it, because her defense would give me the exact excuse I needed to start pulling up the floorboards of this family. The morning after Thanksgiving, the house smelled like stale wine and cold grease. Sunlight cut through the frosted kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over the island. I stood at the counter, a cup of black coffee in my hand, watching Evelyn. My mother was carefully packing leftover turkey into plastic containers. She labeled each lid with blue painter's tape and a Sharpie. She was focused, ensuring Jessica and Trent had the premium cuts to take home. The dark meat and broken pieces were left in a disorganized pile in the roasting pan. Those were for me. I set my coffee mug down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the granite. Trent told his guests he paid for the catering, I said. My voice was level, devoid of accusation, just stating a fact. Evelyn stopped writing. She did not look up. She pressed the strip of blue tape onto the plastic lid and smoothed the edges down. Trent is building his professional network, she said. His CEO was at the table. In corporate America, optics matter. A man in his position cannot tell his superiors that his sister-in-law bought the groceries with a debit card. The optics are built on a lie, I replied. And my debit card. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crumpled thermal receipt, and placed it flat on the counter next to her marker. $612. I want to be reimbursed. Evelyn finally looked at me. Her expression shifted from annoyance to outright condescension. She sighed, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Gabella, do not be petty. You are living under this roof without paying a mortgage. You use the utilities. You sleep in the guest room. The cost of a few turkeys and some vegetables is a fraction of what you owe me for maintaining this estate. Do not embarrass your brother-in-law by bringing this up again. Before I could respond, the kitchen door swung open. Jessica walked in. She was wearing silk pajamas and holding a half-empty mug of tea. Trent trailed behind her, already dressed in a pressed polo shirt and dark jeans, tapping away on his smartphone. "Good morning," Jessica announced, sliding onto a bar stool at the island. She ignored the dirty pans soaking in the sink. "Mom, the turkey was fine, but Trent and I were talking. We need to elevate the menu for next month." I looked at my sister. Next month, Trent stopped typing and looked up, flashing a practiced, authoritative smile. The Logistics Regional Gala. The company usually rents out a ballroom at the Ramada downtown, but I convinced the board that hosting a private, intimate dinner at a historic property would project strength and stability. He gestured around the kitchen. "I am hosting it here. December 23rd, 50 VIPs. Upper management, major accounts, the works." Jessica took a sip of her tea. "It is going to be elegant. Trent's promotion depends on this going perfectly. We are thinking a 5-course tasting menu. Past hors d'oeuvres, a plated fish course, and beef Wellington for the main." I stared at them. Beef Wellington for 50 people required prime center-cut tenderloin, handmade puff pastry, and hours of exact temperature control. In a commercial setting, that menu would cost a client roughly $200 a plate. "Who is catering this event?" I asked. Jessica laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "You are, obviously. You already know the kitchen layout. It makes perfect sense." "No," I said. The single syllable hung in the air. Trent frowned, his smartphone lowering to his side. Jessica stopped laughing. Evelyn stiffened, dropping the dish towel onto the counter. "What do you mean, no?" Jessica asked, her voice rising an octave. "I mean, I am the executive chef of a hospital. I work 60-hour weeks. I do not have the time, the energy, or the budget to execute a luxury corporate event for free. Hire a caterer." Trent stepped forward. His authoritative smile vanished, replaced by the aggressive posture he used to intimidate warehouse managers. "I already submitted the venue plan, Gabriella. I promised my CEO a premier culinary experience. You cannot back out. You owe this family." "I owe you nothing, Trent. You lied to your guests last night. I am not financing your career." Evelyn slammed her hand flat against the granite counter. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. "Enough," she snapped. Her eyes locked onto mine, hard and unyielding. "You will cook for the gala, Gabriella, or you will pack your bags today." I looked at my mother. "You cannot throw me out." "I hold the legal authority over this property," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am the executor. I can sell this house tomorrow and leave you with nothing. Do you want to test me? You can find an apartment in Bismarck in December. Let us see how far your hospital salary stretches when you are paying first, last, and a security deposit." The threat was clear. The temperature outside was dropping below zero. A sudden eviction would devastate my savings and disrupt my career. Evelyn knew exactly where my vulnerabilities lay. I let my shoulders slump. I widened my eyes, forcing a slight tremor into my hands as I reached for my coffee mug. I allowed panic to bleed into my voice. "Mom, please. Tenderloin for 50 people is going to cost over $1,000. The truffle paste alone will wipe out my checking account. I cannot afford this." Jessica smirked, exchanging a triumphant glance with Trent. He crossed his arms over his chest, visibly satisfied. They had found the breaking point. They believed they had crushed my resistance through sheer financial terror. "Figure it out, Gabriella," Jessica said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "You always do. Just put it on a credit card. Trent will make sure to mention your name to the guests if the food is good." Evelyn picked up the blue painter's tape again. "The discussion is over. You will prepare the menu. Now clean these pans." The three of them turned and walked out of the kitchen, their footsteps echoing down the hardwood hallway. They were victorious. They had successfully bullied the scullery maid back into submission. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen. I looked at the crumpled receipt still resting on the counter. My hands stopped trembling. My shoulders straightened. The manufactured panic evaporated, leaving behind a cold, mechanical clarity. Evelyn's entire regime was built on a single pillar of power, the threat of eviction. She constantly claimed she held the legal authority to control my grandmother's estate. But my grandmother was a shrewd, calculating woman. She had seen through Evelyn's reckless spending habits decades ago. She would never have left a valuable historic property under my mother's undisputed control. There was a disconnect between Evelyn's arrogant threats and the legal reality of my grandmother's meticulous nature. I turned away from the sink. I bypassed the soaking pans and walked down the back hallway toward the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The wooden steps groaned under my weight. The air grew progressively colder as I climbed. The attic was a frozen, dust-covered expanse of forgotten history. Cardboard boxes, old furniture covered in white sheets, and stacks of yellowing books. I walked past the holiday decorations and the discarded winter coats. Tucked away in the furthest corner, sitting beneath a small frost-covered window, was a heavy cedar lockbox. It had brass hinges, tarnished green with age. My grandmother used it to store vital records. Evelyn had never bothered to sort through it. She assumed everything of value had already been transferred to her. I knelt on the cold floorboards. My breath formed white clouds in the freezing air. I unlatched the brass hasp and lifted the heavy cedar lid. The smell of old paper and dried lavender filled the space. Inside were stacks of manila envelopes, property tax receipts from the 1990s, and bound legal folios. I began to dig. I was not looking for old photographs or sentimental letters. I was looking for the weapon that would dismantle my mother's dictatorship. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope stamped with the seal of a prominent Fargo law firm. I opened the flap. The documents inside were crisp, heavy stock paper. I pulled them out and began to read the dense, typewritten paragraphs. The words on the page confirmed everything I suspected and introduced a legal reality that would destroy my family's arrogance. Evelyn did not hold the power she claimed. The trap she thought she had set for me was actually closing around her own throat. The freezing air of the attic bit into my skin. I sat on the rough wooden floorboards, my breath forming rhythmic white plumes in the dim light. The cedar lockbox rested between my knees. Inside lay the financial anatomy of my family. I sifted through the manila envelopes with the same methodical precision I used to audit hospital inventory. I was looking for discrepancies. I was looking for the mechanism Evelyn used to keep me trapped. For 7 years, my mother ruled this property using 2 distinct legal phrases: irrevocable power of attorney and life estate. When my grandmother Helen passed away, I knew the house was placed in a trust with my name listed as the sole beneficiary. Helen had told me her intentions during her final days in hospice. She wanted me to have a foundation. But shortly after the funeral, Evelyn produced a document. She claimed Helen granted her total administrative control and the right to reside here until her own death. Evelyn weaponized that claim. She used it to turn my inheritance into my prison. Pay the utilities, maintain the roof, cook the holiday meals, or face immediate eviction. I complied because fighting a life estate in probate court required legal capital I did not possess. I surrendered my autonomy to keep a roof over my head. My fingers brushed against a heavy envelope stamped with the seal of a prominent Fargo law firm. The paper stock was thick and rigid. I pulled out a stapled packet. The blue ink of a notary seal caught the faint light filtering through the frosted window pane. I read the header, Notice of Revocation. I traced the lines of text with my index finger. The legal language was stark and unambiguous. Helen had executed a quiet, brilliant maneuver just 3 weeks before her heart failed. The document formally and permanently revoked Evelyn's power of attorney. A second attached addendum dissolved the provisional life estate, citing gross financial mismanagement. Helen had seen Evelyn draining the family accounts to fund her country club lifestyle. Helen had cut her off to protect the asset, to protect me. I read the signature at the bottom. Helen's handwriting was shaky but deliberate. The date was certified. I sat in the freezing dust and let the truth settle over me. The document in my hands was a shield. Evelyn must have found an early voided draft of her power of attorney after the funeral and paraded it around as gospel. Given my mother's calculating nature, I knew she was deliberately hiding the truth. She had been bluffing for 7 years. She had been threatening me with eviction from a house she had zero legal right to occupy. I owned the walls, the roof, the kitchen, and the floorboards. Evelyn was a guest who had overstayed her welcome by nearly a decade. The resentment that had burned inside me since Thanksgiving dinner turned into a tactical map. The heavy burden of fear evaporated. I folded the documents carefully and slid them into the inner pocket of my fleece jacket. I closed the cedar box and fastened the brass latch. I stood up. The cold stiffness in my joints faded. A voice shattered the silence. It echoed up through the floor vents from the kitchen directly below me. "Gabriella." It was Trent. His voice carried the sharp, impatient tone of a man accustomed to room service. "Gabriella, where are you? I have back-to-back conference calls in 20 minutes, and I need lunch." I walked down the narrow attic stairs, my hand resting over the pocket containing my grandmother's final word. I stepped onto the second-floor landing and descended the main staircase. The air grew warmer, smelling of the coffee Evelyn had brewed earlier. I walked into the kitchen. Trent was sitting at the island, his laptop open. He did not look up when I entered. He just pointed a finger at the refrigerator. "Turkey sandwich," Trent said. "Toasted bread, light mayonnaise, bring it to the home office, and keep the noise down. I am closing a logistics deal with the Chicago branch." 24 hours ago, that command would have spiked my heart rate with quiet fury. I would have made the sandwich feeling the crushing weight of my own servitude. I would have hated myself for complying. Now I looked at the back of his head and felt clinical detachment. You do not feel anger toward a trespasser when you hold the deed to the land. You simply calculate the cost of their removal. "Of course," I said. My voice was smooth, stripped of the manufactured panic I had displayed earlier. Trent picked up his phone and walked out of the room without a backward glance. I walked to the refrigerator. I pulled out the plastic container of leftover dark meat Evelyn had deemed unfit for her own household. I placed 2 slices of sourdough bread into the toaster. I retrieved the mayonnaise and a clean butter knife. I worked with the practiced rhythm of a professional. Spread the condiment, layer the meat, add salt, slice on the diagonal, place it on a ceramic plate. Every motion was a quiet celebration. I was not submitting to a demand. I was executing a final sequence. This was the last meal Trent would ever order from me. He believed he was commanding a servant in his mother-in-law's house. He had no idea he was demanding free labor from his landlord. I picked up the plate and walked down the hallway to the room Evelyn had converted into a home office. Trent was sitting behind the oak desk, a Bluetooth earpiece in his ear. He was speaking loudly about quarterly projections and supply chain margins. I set the plate on the edge of the desk. He did not say thank you. He simply waved his hand in a dismissive gesture, signaling me to leave the room. I turned and walked back to the kitchen. I stood by the island and looked at the space. The 6-burner gas stove, the double convection ovens, the walk-in pantry. This was my kitchen. The upcoming corporate gala was no longer a burden they were forcing upon me. It was the perfect stage. Jessica and Trent wanted a luxury 5-course dinner to impress their corporate superiors. They wanted me to finance it and cook it, remaining out of sight while they harvested the credit. They believed they had cornered me. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded legal folio. I would cook their gala. I would source the finest center-cut tenderloin. I would roll the puff pastry from scratch. I would execute a menu that would make a Michelin inspector weep. I would give them exactly what they demanded. But I would not do it as their hostage. I would do it as a vendor, and vendors require payment. My eyes drifted to the kitchen island. Trent had taken his phone to the office, but he had left his laptop sitting on the granite counter. The screen was awake. Next to the keyboard sat a small rectangular piece of plastic, his corporate American Express card. It sat there, catching the overhead light, a quiet testament to his arrogance and his carelessness. I walked over to the island. I looked at the embossed numbers and the corporate logo on the card. Then my gaze shifted to the bright screen of his open laptop. A new layer of their entitlement was about to reveal itself. I was about to discover exactly how Trent planned to profit from the feast I was supposed to fund. I stared at the glowing screen of Trent's laptop, my eyes scanning the top line of a spreadsheet. Before my brain could process the columns of numbers, heavy footsteps vibrated against the hardwood floor of the hallway. Trent strode back into the kitchen. He did not look at me. He snatched the corporate credit card from the granite island, slid it into his leather wallet, and slammed the laptop shut. "Have the initial menu proposal ready by tonight," he said, tucking the computer under his arm. "My boss expects a regional update tomorrow morning, and I want to assure him the venue and catering are locked down." He walked away, leaving me standing in the silence of the kitchen. The secret buried inside that machine would have to wait. I had an event to plan. I walked over to the stainless steel prep table and unrolled my black canvas knife case. I reached into the center slot and withdrew an 8-inch Wusthof chef knife. The handle was black synthetic polymer, triple riveted over a full tang. The blade was forged from a single piece of high-carbon stainless steel. I held the handle, feeling the familiar balanced weight. It was not just a piece of culinary equipment. It was an inheritance. My grandmother Helen had given it to me on my 18th birthday, right before I left for culinary school. I remembered standing in this exact kitchen, the sunlight hitting the edge of the metal. She had handed me a heavy steel honing rod. She placed her hands over mine, guiding the blade at a precise 20-degree angle down the textured rod. The sound was a sharp, rhythmic ringing. Metal shaving metal. A dull blade slips and cuts you, she had told me, her voice steady and firm. A sharp blade does exactly what you command. She took the knife back, wiped the edge with a cloth, and pointed the tip toward the cutting board. This tool requires respect, Gabriella, and so do you. Do not ever let anyone treat you like a blunt instrument. I thought about Evelyn using that same blade to pry open shipping boxes, grinding the delicate edge against industrial adhesive and cardboard. The contrast was a perfect summary of my existence in this house. My mother viewed my professional dignity as a household utility. But the dynamic had changed. I was holding the title to the property in my coat pocket. I no longer needed to endure their disrespect. I was simply managing a difficult client until the contract was fulfilled. The preparation for the December gala became a daily theater of endurance. Jessica treated the event as her personal coronation. She strutted into the kitchen every morning wearing designer athleisure, holding a ceramic mug of green tea, dictating her demands while I chopped vegetables and reduced stocks. She rejected my initial proposal for roasted chicken and seasonal squash. "We need something elevated," she said, scrolling through her phone. Trent's CEO dined at a Michelin star restaurant in Chicago last week. "We cannot serve poultry. I want passed scallops with a citrus crudo, handmade agnolotti stuffed with ricotta, and beef Wellington for the main course." I kept my hands moving, dicing a white onion with rapid, uniform strikes. "Center-cut beef tenderloin for 50 people is expensive," I said, setting the knife down. "I need an approved budget. I need Trent to provide the funds up front." Jessica rolled her eyes, exhaling a sharp breath of irritation. "Stop worrying about every little dime. Just put the ingredients on your debit card. Trent will reimburse you after the event. You are acting like we are trying to steal from you." I did not argue. Arguing with Jessica was like throwing water at a grease fire. I simply nodded, picked up my knife, and went back to the cutting board. I would buy the ingredients. I would document every transaction. 2 days later, I visited my wholesale meat purveyor. I purchased $400 worth of prime, center-cut beef tenderloin. I wrapped the heavy cuts in thick butcher paper, sealed them in vacuum bags, and placed them in the chest freezer located in the unheated garage. The next morning, I walked out to the garage to retrieve a bag of frozen stock. The air was frigid, smelling of motor oil and cold dust. I stepped toward the chest freezer and froze. The low, steady hum of the compressor was missing. The machine was dead silent. I looked down at the concrete floor. A small pool of water was seeping out from underneath the bottom edge of the appliance. I dropped to my knees and looked at the wall outlet. The thick, black power cord was lying on the ground. It had been deliberately pulled from the socket. I threw open the heavy lid of the freezer. A wave of cool air hit my face, but it lacked the sharp, biting frost it should have possessed. I pressed my palm against the vacuum-sealed tenderloins. The surface of the meat was soft. The deep freeze was failing. I gathered the heavy packages into my arms, rushed them out to my car, and drove directly to the hospital. I secured the meat inside my commercial walk-in cooler, saving the $400 investment with perhaps an hour to spare. When I returned to the house, Jessica was sitting in the living room painting her fingernails a pale shade of pink. "Did you unplug the garage freezer?" I asked. My tone was flat. She did not look up from her nails. "Oh, yes. I needed the outlet to plug in my portable space heater while I was looking for old photo albums out there. The garage is freezing. You left a chest full of expensive meat without power. Jessica blew softly on her wet nails and offered a lazy, dismissive shrug. It is just a freezer, Gabriella. Stop being so dramatic. The meat is fine. You are always looking for a reason to play the victim. I stared at her. The casual cruelty in her posture told me everything. She had not forgotten to plug it back in. She had pulled the cord intentionally. This was not just entitlement. It was active, calculated sabotage. Jessica resented the quiet focus I brought to the kitchen. She wanted me panicked. She wanted me rushing, crying over ruined ingredients, begging for their help. She wanted to break my professional composure so she could feel superior. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum. I turned around and walked out the front door. I drove to the local hardware supply store. I walked down the security aisle and selected a heavy steel hasp, a box of 3-inch mounting screws, and a commercial-grade brass padlock. I returned to the house while Jessica was out at a salon appointment. I gathered my power drill and went straight to the kitchen. I attached the steel hasp to the thick wooden frame of the walk-in pantry door. I drove the screws deep into the studs. I loaded every expensive ingredient, every piece of specialized equipment, and every ounce of dry goods into that small room. I closed the door, slid the brass padlock through the hasp, and snapped it shut. The heavy click echoed off the granite countertops. I slipped the sole key onto my personal key ring. I walked over to the kitchen island, opened my personal laptop, and launched a fresh spreadsheet. I titled the document, Corporate Catering Invoice. I typed in the first row, prime beef tenderloin. I entered the wholesale cost, then applied a standard catering markup of 200%. I created a labor column. I assigned myself the title of Executive Chef and set my hourly rate at $150. I logged the time spent sourcing, prepping, and securing the inventory. The numbers climbed. The total at the bottom of the screen was no longer a symbol of my exploitation. It was a tactical weapon. I closed the laptop and looked at the locked pantry door. The ingredients were secure. The property deed was hidden in my coat. The invoice was building. But to make the trap inescapable, I needed to know exactly who was supposed to pay that final bill. I needed to see the corporate financial records Trent had snatched away from me days ago. I waited for the sun to go down. I waited for the house to fall silent. Then I walked softly toward Trent's home office. The nighttime reconnaissance yielded nothing. Trent had locked the heavy oak door of his home office. I did not test the brass knob. In a professional kitchen, timing dictates the success of any complex dish. You do not pull a resting roast from the heat before the internal fibers relax. You wait. I returned to my room, set my alarm for dawn, and allowed the house to sleep. Morning arrived with a low, overcast sky. Snow began to fall, dusting the frosted glass of the kitchen windows. I stood by the espresso machine, pulling a dark shot. I wore my standard hospital uniform, charcoal slacks, a white double-breasted chef coat, and non-slip safety shoes. Trent marched into the room. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a silver wristwatch. He carried his sleek computer in one hand and a leather wallet in the other. He dropped the device onto the granite island, flipped the lid open, and typed in his security password. His cell phone vibrated inside his breast pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the caller ID, and his posture shifted. His shoulders tightened. He cleared his throat, transforming his expression into a mask of eager compliance. Richard Trent answered, utilizing the overly enthusiastic tone reserved for upper management. Good morning. Yes, the regional logistics forecast is ready for review. Give me 1 moment to step out to the patio. The reception indoors is terrible. He pushed open the sliding glass door and stepped out into the freezing cold. He pulled the heavy glass shut behind him to block the winter wind. He left his computer open. The screen glowed bright against the dim morning light. Next to the keyboard, he had extracted a card from his wallet, a corporate American Express. The raised silver numbers caught the ambient light. It sat there, a tiny plastic rectangle, symbolizing corporate trust and institutional wealth. I set my espresso cup down. The ceramic made no sound against the counter. I walked around the island and positioned myself in front of the illuminated monitor. It was an Excel document. The header contained the official logo of Trent's logistics firm. The title read, Expense Reimbursement Request Form Q4. I scanned the rows. Travel, lodging, client dinners. Then, near the bottom, a single customized line item jumped out. Date, December 23rd. Vendor, Premier Catering Service. Description, Regional VIP Holiday Gala, Food and Beverage. I looked at the far right column. The requested reimbursement amount was $12,500. I stopped breathing. The low hum of the refrigerator faded into the background. I read the line again, verifying the digits. 12,500. I am accustomed to reading vendor invoices. I approve thousands of dollars in hospital purchasing orders every week. I know what legitimate billing looks like. There is no Premier Catering Service registered in Bismarck. Trent had invented a phantom culinary company. The architecture of his scam assembled itself in my mind with terrifying clarity. Trent's logistics firm allocated a substantial entertainment budget for regional managers to woo clients and executives. If Trent hired a legitimate catering company for the Christmas event, the firm would pay that vendor directly using the corporate American Express card sitting on the counter. But Trent had a different strategy. He intended to use me. He demanded I purchase the high-end ingredients out of my own savings. He demanded I prep, cook, and serve a 5-course Michelin-quality meal for 50 corporate executives. He demanded my silence and my invisibility. Once the event concluded, he would submit this forged invoice to his accounting department. Because the Phantom Catering Company did not possess a merchant account to accept a credit card payment, he would claim he paid the vendor out of his personal funds and request a direct cash reimbursement. The logistics firm would wire $12,500 into his personal checking account. He would pocket the entire sum tax-free. He was not just stealing my labor. He was committing federal wire fraud, using my culinary expertise as the vehicle for his embezzlement. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I swiped the screen to unlock the camera. I held the device steady over the keyboard. I tapped the screen to focus on the $12,500 figure, ensuring the company logo and Trent's employee identification number were clearly visible in the frame. I pressed the shutter button. The phone captured a crisp, high-resolution image. I adjusted my angle. I moved the camera down to include the corporate American Express card resting on the granite framing it, right next to the fraudulent spreadsheet. I took a second photograph. When a family views you as an appliance, they get careless, and careless people leave paper trails. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The digital evidence was secure. Trent's voice bled through the glass of the patio door. He was pacing, gesturing animatedly with his free hand, assuring his CEO that the upcoming gala would be the premier networking event of the financial quarter. I stepped back from the island and returned to the espresso machine. I picked up my cup and took a slow sip. The dark roast was bitter and hot. The layers of my family's deception were now perfectly stacked, forming a fragile, toxic tower. Evelyn was committing property fraud, holding me hostage with a revoked power of attorney to maintain her illusion of ownership. Jessica was executing emotional abuse and physical sabotage, unplugging freezers to keep me panicked and compliant. And Trent was engineering corporate embezzlement, risking federal prison to line his own pockets. They were all operating under the assumption that I was a passive, ignorant servant who would endure any indignity to keep a roof over my head. But standing in that kitchen, armed with a photographic record of Trent's felony and the legal deed to the property tucked in my coat pocket, I realized the severe danger I was actually facing. If Trent's accounting department ever audited this event, an investigator would trace the meal back to me. They would see 50 executives eating a luxury dinner. They would ask for my vendor licenses, my tax receipts, my proof of payment. If I cooked this meal without a formal contract, I could be implicated in his scam. I could be viewed as an uncompensated accomplice in a scheme to defraud a major logistics corporation. My professional reputation was my only true asset. I had spent a decade building my career in the hospital network. A single whisper of financial fraud would strip me of my credentials, destroy my security clearance, and end my career in commercial food service forever. I could not simply pack my bags and walk out the front door. Leaving would not sever the liability. I needed an ironclad, documented boundary. I needed to interact with Trent, not as a sister-in-law, but as a hostile corporate entity. I watched Trent end his phone call. He pulled open the sliding glass door, shivering as a gust of winter wind followed him inside. He rubbed his hands together, walked back to the island, and picked up his card. "The CEO is bringing 2 extra board members to the dinner," he announced, typing a quick update into his spreadsheet. "Make sure you increase the portion counts, and do not ask me for more grocery money. You already have your marching orders. I will adjust the numbers I said." He closed the laptop, tucked it under his arm, and marched down the hallway to his home office. I washed my espresso cup and dried it with a towel. I placed it in the cupboard. I took off my chef coat and draped it over a dining chair. I retrieved my winter parka from the hall closet. I needed legal architecture. I needed a professional to draft a contract that would retroactively legitimize the catering service while simultaneously trapping Trent in his own deceit. And I needed to formalize the eviction of the trespassers occupying my house. I picked up my car keys. I had a 45-minute drive ahead of me. I was heading to Fargo. I had an appointment to make. The drive to Fargo took 45 minutes. The heater in my Honda Civic blasted dry air against the windshield, melting the frost creeping in from the edges. Interstate 94 was a gray ribbon stretching across the flat, snow-covered plains. The isolation of the landscape mirrored the precise, solitary nature of the plan I was assembling. I arrived at a nondescript brick building in a commercial park. The sign on the glass door read, "Davis & Associates, Property and Corporate Law." I walked inside. The receptionist directed me to a small conference room smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. Attorney Martin Davis walked in 3 minutes later. He was in his late 50s, wearing a tweed jacket and carrying a yellow legal pad. He possessed the tired, skeptical demeanor of a man who spent his career dissecting other people's bad decisions. I sat across from him. I did not waste time with emotional anecdotes about my childhood. I did not complain about Evelyn's cashmere sweaters or Jessica's entitlement. I treated the consultation like a budget review at the hospital. I laid out the facts. I unzipped my coat and withdrew the heavy cedar box envelope. I placed my grandmother's notarized revocation of the power of attorney on the conference table. Next to it, I placed the addendum dissolving the life estate. Then I unlocked my smartphone. I opened the high-resolution photograph of Trent's forged expense report and slid the device across the polished wood. Davis picked up the property documents first. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He flipped to the signature page, verifying the notary seal and the date. He set the papers down and picked up my phone. He zoomed in on the Excel spreadsheet, noting the corporate logo, the vendor name, and the $12,500 total. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Your mother has been operating under a voided legal instrument for 7 years, Davis said, his tone a mix of professional disbelief and quiet respect. "She has essentially been a squatter. The property transferred to the trust upon your grandmother's death, and since you are the sole trustee and beneficiary, you hold absolute title. Evelyn has zero authority to evict you." "I am aware," I said. "I need the deed registration updated and filed with the county clerk immediately. I want the public record to reflect my sole ownership." "We can file that electronically by noon," Davis confirmed, picking up his pen. "But the situation with your brother-in-law is far more volatile. This photograph demonstrates intent to commit corporate embezzlement. If you provide catering services for this corporate event without a formal contract, and his firm audits his expense report, you could be viewed as an uncompensated co-conspirator. You are subsidizing his fraud. That is why I am here. I am not backing out of cooking the gala. I am going to execute the menu. But I need to transform myself from a domestic servant into an independent contractor. I handed Davis a printed spreadsheet. It was the detailed catering invoice I had built on my laptop. It listed the prime tenderloin, the specialty ingredients, and my labor hours calculated at a premium executive chef rate. The total at the bottom matched the exact figure Trent had fabricated on his expense report: $12,500. I want you to draft an official catering contract, I instructed. I need a document that legally binds him to pay for my services. It needs to include a clause demanding immediate payment upon the delivery of the goods. Davis reviewed my spreadsheet, a slow, appreciative smile forming on his face. He understood the mechanics of the trap. If we draft this contract and send him the invoice, he's legally obligated to pay you. But he expects you to do this for free. Why would he agree to this? I am not going to ask him to agree, I said. I am going to send the digital invoice to his corporate email address on the morning of the gala. I will label the subject line, "For your records." Trent is arrogant and greedy. The corporate fiscal year closes on December 31st. If he wants that reimbursement money deposited into his personal account before January, he has to submit his expense report to his accounting department before the holiday break. Davis nodded, catching the rhythm of the strategy. And to pass the audit, he needs a legitimate-looking invoice from a vendor to attach to his request. You are providing him the exact paperwork he needs to complete his scam. Yes, I replied. He will forward my invoice to his accounting department the second he receives it, believing he has outsmarted everyone. But the moment he forwards that invoice, he legally accepts the debt. He establishes me as a verified vendor, and he documents his obligation to pay the $12,500. He locks himself into the fraud, and he insulates me from it. Davis wrote rapidly on his yellow pad. The crisp, heavy sound of his pen scratching against the paper contrasted sharply with the greasy, torn grocery receipts I usually handled. We will draft the catering contract and generate a formal digital invoice, Davis said. I will also draft a standard 30-day notice to quit, an eviction notice. It will name Evelyn, Jessica, and Trent as unauthorized occupants of your property. Do not mail the eviction notice, I said. Keep it in a sealed envelope. I will serve it to them personally. I want to deliver it the moment the catering invoice comes due. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the legal infrastructure was complete. The updated deed was filed with the county. The catering invoice was formatted as a secure PDF bearing my name and professional title. The 30-day eviction notice rested securely in a heavy black leather folio tucked under my arm. I shook Davis's hand, walked out into the freezing parking lot, and drove back to Bismarck. I arrived at the house mid-afternoon. The front door was unlocked. I walked inside, stomping the snow off my boots in the entryway. The house was quiet, save for the sound of Evelyn humming in the living room. I walked into the kitchen. My mother was standing by the hall closet. She was pulling my heavy winter coats off the wooden hangers, tossing them unceremoniously into a plastic laundry basket. She turned when she heard my boots on the hardwood. "Oh, good, you are back," Evelyn said, her tone brisk and unapologetic. "I am moving your coats out to the garage. We need to clear the hall closet to make room for Trent's VIP guests tonight. His CEO is bringing his wife, and they wear full-length cashmere. I cannot have your hospital jackets taking up space." I looked at the plastic basket. My coats were crumpled against each other. "The garage is unheated," I observed. "They are winter coats, Gabriella. They are designed for the cold. Now stop hovering and get into the kitchen. The guests arrive at 6 o'clock, and Jessica said the past hors d'oeuvres need to be ready the moment they walk through the door." A younger version of myself would have argued. I would have felt the sting of displacement, the quiet humiliation of having my belongings banished to an uninsulated garage so a stranger's cashmere could hang in my own home. But standing there feeling the weight of the black leather folio under my arm, the humiliation did not register. You do not argue with a tenant who is moving your furniture. You simply add it to the final bill. "I will take the basket to the garage," I said softly. Evelyn looked mildly surprised by my compliance, but she quickly recovered her authoritative posture. "See that you do. and make sure the kitchen is spotless before they arrive. I picked up the laundry basket. I carried my coats through the kitchen and out into the freezing garage. I set them next to the chest freezer. The air was sharp and bitter. I walked back inside, secured the black leather folio in my bedroom, and returned to the kitchen. I tied my apron around my waist. I unlocked the heavy brass padlock on the pantry door. It was time to cook. The guests were coming. The trap was set. But as I began reducing the wine for the Wellington sauce, a new variable entered the equation. I heard Trent speaking in the living room, confirming the final guest list with Jessica. The name he mentioned made my hands stop moving. The stakes of the evening were about to double. The sun dropped below the horizon shortly after 4 o'clock. By 5, the snow began to fall in heavy, deliberate sheets, blanketing Bismarck in a thick layer of winter white. Inside the house, the temperature was rising. The commercial ovens hummed, radiating a steady, intense heat. I moved through the kitchen with the measured, efficient rhythm I used to command a hospital tray line. 50 portions of center-cut beef tenderloin rested on stainless steel prep tables. I had seared them precisely, locking in the juices, before wrapping them in layers of prosciutto mushroom duxelle and handmade puff pastry. The air was saturated with the rich, heavy aromas of roasted garlic, reducing red wine, and clarified butter. I was not cooking for a family gathering. I was executing a professional catering contract. The digital invoice for $12,500 had been dispatched to Trent's corporate email at exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon. The subject line read, "For your records." The email tracking software confirmed he opened the document at 3:15. At 3:20, he forwarded the invoice to the logistics firm's accounting department. He had taken the bait. He had legally bound himself to the debt, establishing my status as a contracted vendor. The front doorbell chimed at 6 o'clock sharp. The sound of heavy boots, expensive coats rustling, and loud, confident voices filled the entryway. The corporate executives had arrived. I remained out of sight, standing by the island, focusing on the first course. Citrus-cured sea scallops resting on individual ceramic spoons. The preparation required absolute precision. 1 drop of acid too much, and the delicate protein would turn rubbery. I worked silently, my hands steady, my mind calculating the timing of the next course. The swinging door pushed open. Jessica breezed into the kitchen. She was wearing a floor-length emerald green gown that retailed for nearly $1,000. Her hair was styled into a severe, elegant updo. She carried a champagne flute and an air of absolute authority. "They are here," she announced, her voice tight with nervous energy. "Trent is making the introductions now. The CEO is in a fantastic mood. Do not ruin this, Gabriella." She walked past the prep tables, her eyes scanning the trays of perfectly uniform hors d'oeuvres. She reached out, intending to pluck a scallop from a spoon. I placed the flat edge of my chef knife gently but firmly against the cutting board. The sharp metal sound caused her to freeze. "The acid is still curing the protein," I said. "They need another 4 minutes before service. Do not touch them." Jessica pulled her hand back, her lips pressing into a thin line of annoyance. She surveyed my flour-dusted uniform and the sweat beading on my forehead. "Just make sure the trays are moving constantly," she snapped, recovering her arrogant posture. "And remember what we discussed. Once the main courses are plated and served, you stay in the kitchen. Trent wants to project a certain image of effortless hospitality. Having you wandering around the dining room in a stained apron does not fit the aesthetic. You are meant to be invisible." "Understood," I replied. My voice was a flat, unreadable mask. Jessica turned and pushed back through the swinging doors, returning to her performance. I picked up a silver serving tray. I arranged the ceramic spoons in perfect geometric lines. The irony of the situation hung thick in the heated air. Trent was standing 50 feet away, drinking vintage wine, surrounded by his superiors, boasting about his ability to secure premier catering on a tight corporate budget. He believed he was exploiting a vulnerable relative. He believed his cheap in-house chef was hiding in the kitchen out of shame. He had no idea that the woman he was treating like a secret was currently holding the deed to the ground he was standing on, and a legally binding invoice for his entire entertainment budget. I pushed through the kitchen doors and stepped into the periphery of the living room. The space was transformed. 50 people in tailored suits and cocktail dresses stood in small clusters, nursing drinks and talking loudly about market shares and supply chain logistics. Trent was standing near the fireplace, holding court with a group of older men. His chest was puffed out, his face flushed with the attention. "The key to managing a territory this size," Trent was saying, his voice projecting over the ambient noise, "is knowing when to deploy premium resources. You cannot compromise on quality." When I decided to host this event, I told my team we needed the absolute best. A private estate, a customized menu. You have to spend money to make money. One of the men laughed, clapping Trent on the shoulder. "Well, Trent, you certainly went all out. The venue is impressive, very historic. It belongs to the family," Trent said smoothly, leaning into the lie. "We decided to keep it intimate. Let the catering speak for itself." I walked the perimeter of the room, extending the silver tray toward the guests. I moved like a shadow, silent, efficient, avoiding eye contact. The executives plucked the ceramic spoons from the tray, murmured brief sounds of approval as they tasted the scallops, and continued their conversations. I was exactly what Jessica demanded. Invisible. I returned to the kitchen, swapped the empty tray for a full one, and repeated the circuit. The first course was a flawless success. The timing was perfect. The execution was clinical. By 7:30, the guests began migrating toward the massive mahogany dining table. The transition from past appetizers to the seated main course required military coordination. I moved back into the kitchen, increasing the oven temperatures to bring the beef Wellingtons to their final resting state. The heat in the kitchen was intense, but my mind was ice cold. I was calculating the final steps of the operation. The trap was set, the legal documents were secured in my black folio, the invoice was submitted, the food was cooked. But as I pulled the first tray of golden, perfectly baked Wellingtons from the oven, the swinging door opened again. It was not Jessica. It was Evelyn. My mother looked flustered. She was carrying a stack of empty cocktail glasses. She dumped them roughly into the sink. "You need to hurry up at the main course," Evelyn hissed, leaning over the island. "Trent just seated the CEO at the head of the table. He wants the food served immediately." I transferred the heavy baking sheet to the cooling rack. "The meat needs to rest for 10 minutes, Evelyn. If I cut it now, the juices will bleed out and ruin the pastry." Evelyn slammed her hand on the counter. "I do not care about the pastry. Trent is trying to close a massive regional account tonight. He needs the CEO impressed right now. Cut the meat and plate it." I looked at my mother. I looked at the panicked, desperate entitlement in her eyes. She was willing to compromise the quality of a 5-star meal just to maintain the illusion of control. She was terrified of looking incompetent in front of strangers. "The meat rests for 10 minutes, I repeated. My voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute authority I used to run my hospital kitchen. Do not tell me how to manage my service. Evelyn stared at me, shocked by the sudden resistance. Before she could launch into her familiar threat of eviction, the kitchen door pushed open a third time. Trent stuck his head into the room. His face was red, sweating from the heat and the alcohol. "Where is the beef?" Trent demanded, his voice thick with irritation. "Richard is waiting. It is resting," I said. "Well, unrest it. Bring it out." Richard just asked who was running the kitchen, and I told him it was a premier catering firm. I need the plates on the table before he starts asking too many questions. Trent pulled his head back, and the door swung shut. I stood in the center of the kitchen. The name hung in the air heavier than the smell of the roasted garlic. Richard. I walked over to the small circular window set into the swinging door. I wiped a smudge of flour off the glass and looked through it out into the dining room. I scanned the length of the mahogany table past the logistics managers and the regional directors until my eyes locked onto the man sitting at the head of the table, the CEO, Richard. My hands went numb. The carefully constructed timeline of my plan suddenly accelerated. The stakes did not just double, they inverted. Trent had accidentally invited the one man in North Dakota who could instantly verify my true professional status. The one man who could recognize the absolute absurdity of Trent's lies. The one man who possessed the power to destroy my career with a single phone call or validate my entire existence. I stepped away from the door, my heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm against my ribs. I needed to pivot. The strategy of remaining an invisible vendor was no longer viable. I was about to step into the dining room and expose my family, but I was also about to expose myself to my ultimate boss. I stepped away from the swinging door, the brass hinges settling into silence. I had seen the profile of the man sitting at the head of the dining table, but the distortion of the smudged glass left a fraction of a doubt. In my profession, you do not operate on fractions. You verify your inventory. I needed absolute proximity to confirm the identity of the executive sitting in my house. I turned to the stainless steel prep counter. I picked up a silver tray holding the palate cleansers, small ceramic spoons bearing lemon basil sorbet designed to clear the heavy richness of the appetizers before the main course. I balanced the tray on my left palm, pushed through the wooden doors, and stepped onto the hardwood floor of the dining room. The volume of 50 simultaneous conversations washed over me. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, roasted garlic, and melting candle wax. Trent stood near the head of the table, holding a bottle of vintage Bordeaux. He leaned over the primary guest, his posture radiating eager servitude. Richard Trent said, pouring the dark liquid into a crystal glass, "I secured this specific vintage for tonight. The caterer assured me it pairs perfectly with the beef." The guest turned his head to acknowledge the pour. The ambient light from the chandelier caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the tailored break of his lapel, and the distinct silver at his temples. The fraction of doubt vanished. It was Richard Sterling, the chief executive officer of Trent's logistics firm. I kept my head lowered, moving silently along the perimeter of the room, extending the silver tray to the seated guests. My hands remained steady, but a cold spike of adrenaline pierced my chest. Richard Sterling was not just a logistics executive. In the architecture of American corporate governance, powerful men often diversify their influence across multiple industries. Sterling sat on the board of directors for the Regional Medical Network where I was employed. He was the chairman of the Financial Oversight Committee. Only 90 days ago, I had stood in a sterile, fluorescent-lit boardroom located on the top floor of the hospital administration building. I wore my crisp, white chef coat. I stood at the end of a long glass table, defending my $2 million dietary budget. Sterling sat at the opposite end. He had interrogated every line item on my spreadsheet. He questioned my supply chain vendors, my labor allocation, and my waste reduction metrics. He was meticulous, piercing, and unforgiving of incompetence. I did not flinch during that meeting. I answered every inquiry with hard data. I demonstrated how my kitchen reduced operational overhead while improving patient nutritional outcomes. Sterling had listened, lowered his pen, and signed the fiscal approval himself. He looked me directly in the eye and called me Chef Wright. He knew my face. He knew my exact title. He knew the scale of my authority. And now he was sitting in my dining room listening to a mid-level regional manager claim he had hired a cheap local catering firm. I placed a spoon of sorbet near the elbow of a logistics director. I moved toward the sideboard, my mind running a rapid, terrifying calculation. If Trent executed his embezzlement scheme, he would submit the $12,500 invoice to his accounting department. He would request a direct cash reimbursement. Because of the high dollar amount, that expense report would require executive sign-off. It would cross Richard Sterling's desk. Sterling was a relentless auditor. If he investigated the Phantom Premier catering service and tied the event back to this address, he would uncover my identity. He would not see a victimized sister-in-law being bullied into providing free labor. Corporate compliance officers do not care about family dynamics. They care about liability. Sterling would see the executive chef of his hospital network providing off-the-books, undocumented services for a logistics manager who was simultaneously forging invoices. He would assume we were running a coordinated kickback scheme. He would conclude I was an active, willing participant in federal wire fraud. My career would not just end. It would detonate. My pension, my security clearance, my decade of grueling ascendance through the culinary ranks would be erased. I would be blacklisted from every commercial kitchen in the Midwest. Trent's arrogant lie was no longer just a household annoyance. It was a radioactive threat to my livelihood. I placed the empty silver tray on the sideboard. Sterling was deep in conversation with a vice president and did not glance in my direction. I slipped backward, pushing through the swinging doors and returning to the safety of the kitchen. The heat of the room hit me like a physical wall. The digital timer on the convection oven was ticking down. 3 minutes left on the resting meat. Evelyn was pacing in front of the island, her arms crossed over her chest. Jessica stood near the refrigerator holding her smartphone, tapping her high heel against the linoleum floor. "What took you so long out there?" Jessica hissed, looking up from her screen. "Trent just texted me. The CEO finished his sorbet. He wants the Wellingtons plated right now." I walked over to the stainless steel prep table. The golden, flaky crusts of the pastries radiated a savory warmth. The meat inside was prime, the execution flawless. It was the finest meal I had prepared all year. "The meat needs another 2 minutes to rest," I said. My voice was a hollow, mechanical instrument. Evelyn stepped forward, her face flushing with irritation. "Gabriela, stop being difficult. The resting time does not matter. The optics matter. Trent is losing momentum at the table. Plate the food." I looked at the Wellingtons. Then I looked at the Wusthof chef knife resting on my cutting board. If I sliced that meat, if I placed those portions onto porcelain plates and allowed Jessica to carry them out to the dining room, the transaction would be complete. Trent would secure his fraudulent victory. The dinner would be served, the trap would close, and I would be permanently tied to his financial crime in front of my own board chairman. I could not serve the food. I could not allow Trent to consume the meal and submit the invoice. I needed to shatter the illusion before the first bite was taken. I needed to force the reality of the situation into the open, in front of Sterling, ensuring the liability fell entirely on the man who forged the documents. "Did you hear me?" Evelyn demanded, stepping closer to the prep table. "I am the executor of this estate, and I am ordering you to serve this dinner." I picked up a clean linen towel. I wiped my hands methodically, drying each finger. I looked at my mother, noting the desperate, clinging entitlement in her posture. She was still relying on a voided legal document to command me. She had no idea the ground beneath her feet had already shifted. "The food is not going into the dining room," I said. Jessica scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Stop playing games. You are not going to ruin my husband's career over a temper tantrum." "I am not throwing a tantrum," I replied, turning my back to them. I walked toward the far corner of the kitchen, where the heavy equipment was stored. I had to execute a maneuver that protected my job, legally enforced the debt, and neutralized my family's power, all within the next 60 seconds. I reached for the heavy plastic handles of the storage units stacked against the wall. The time for silent compliance was over. It was time to pack. The tension in the kitchen crystallized. Evelyn and Jessica stood frozen, their faces registering a sudden, profound confusion. They were accustomed to my quiet frustration. They were used to my forced compliance. But the sight of me grabbing the thick, molded plastic handles of the commercial equipment signaled a drastic departure from the established script. I pulled the first Cambro hotbox away from the wall. It was a heavy-duty, insulated carrier designed to transport commercial catering orders while maintaining precise internal temperatures. The dark gray exterior was scuffed from years of hospital service. I hauled it toward the stainless steel prep table and popped the heavy metal latches. The insulated door swung open. "What are you doing?" Jessica demanded, her voice losing its arrogant edge. She took a step forward, her high heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. "Those are not serving platters." I ignored her. I picked up a heavy-gauge baking sheet holding 6 perfectly rested beef Wellingtons. The pastry crusts were golden brown, the seams flawlessly sealed to lock in the juices. I slid the entire sheet into the top rail of the Cambro. The metal grated against the plastic track. I picked up a second sheet, then a third. "Gabriella, stop," Evelyn commanded. Her voice cracked slightly, the authoritative tone slipping as she processed my actions. "Those belong in the dining room. Trent is waiting." "Trent is waiting for a premier catering service," I said, sliding the final sheet of tenderloin into the insulated cavity. "He is about to experience their cancellation policy." I pushed the heavy door of the hot box shut and snapped the latches down. The airtight seal locked with a definitive mechanical click. "You are insane!" Jessica shrieked. She lunged toward the table, her hands reaching for the silver carving knife resting near the cutting board. She intended to hack into the remaining roast to salvage the meat and force the service herself. I stepped into her path, blocking her access to the blade. I did not raise my hands. I did not shout. I simply stood my ground, my posture rigid, anchoring myself with the physical authority of a professional chef defending her station. "Do not touch my equipment," I said. My voice was a low, steady current. Jessica recoiled, pulling her hands back as if she had touched a live wire. She looked at Evelyn, her eyes wide with genuine panic. The realization was setting in. I was not throwing a tantrum. I was executing a controlled demolition. I turned my back to them. I grabbed 2 deep hotel pans filled with roasted winter root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, and fingerling potatoes glistening with clarified butter and fresh thyme. I loaded them into the second Cambro carrier. I secured the latches. The kitchen was rapidly emptying of consumable food. In less than 3 minutes, I had packed the entire 5-course dinner into commercial transport containers. The air still smelled of roasted garlic and reducing wine, but the counters were barren. "You cannot do this," Evelyn said. Her voice trembled. She moved toward the swinging doors, placing her back against the wood, as if she could physically prevent me from leaving. "The CEO is out there. Trent's career depends on this meal. If you ruin this, I swear to God, I will have you removed from this house by the sheriff tonight." "You are welcome to try," I replied. I grabbed my keyring from the island. I walked toward the walk-in pantry. Inside sat the remaining dry goods, the expensive finishing salts, the truffles, and the reserve bottles of wine. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut. I threaded the commercial-grade brass padlock through the steel hasp I had installed the previous day. I pushed the shackle up until it snapped closed. The heavy metal click echoed loudly in the quiet room. I slipped the key back into my pocket. The kitchen was secure. "Gabriella." The shout came from the hallway. Trent's voice, muffled by the walls, carried a frantic, sharp urgency. He had realized the gap between courses was extending beyond acceptable limits. "Gabriella, bring the food out now. Richard is asking for the main course." Evelyn's face drained of color. She looked at the locked pantry door, then at the sealed hot boxes resting on the prep table. Her empire of threats was dissolving in real time. She was staring at a culinary void. "Unlock that door," Evelyn ordered, her voice a desperate, ragged whisper. "Put the food on the platters. We can still fix this." I did not answer. I gripped the molded handles of the stacked Cambro units. I tipped the carrier backward onto its heavy-duty casters. The wheels engaged. I pushed the towering stack of insulated food past the kitchen island, navigating the narrow space between the counter and the refrigerator. "Where are you taking that?" Jessica yelled, grabbing my arm. Her manicured nails dug into the fabric of my chef coat. I stopped. I turned my head slowly and looked at her hand. I did not speak. I simply stared at her fingers clutching my sleeve until she released her grip and stepped back. I pushed the carrier toward the back door. The mudroom entrance led directly to the driveway where I had parked my rented transit van. I shoved the heavy door open. The freezing North Dakota wind blasted into the kitchen, carrying flakes of snow across the linoleum floor. I rolled the hot boxes over the threshold, the wheels crunching against the salt and ice on the concrete. I pushed them to the rear of the transit van. I unlocked the double doors, threw them wide, and hoisted the heavy carriers into the cargo bay. I pushed them deep into the back, securing them against the side wall. The heat radiating from the boxes met the freezing air, creating a faint mist in the dark. I slammed the van doors shut. I locked the vehicle. I stood in the driveway for a moment, the icy wind cutting through my thin chef coat. The physical labor of the heist was complete. The luxury meal, the leverage my family intended to use to exploit me, was secure. But the operation was only half finished. I could not simply drive away and leave the situation unresolved. Trent had submitted a fraudulent invoice to his accounting department. I had established a legal paper trail. If I disappeared into the snow without formalizing the cancellation of the contract in front of Richard Sterling, I left a massive vulnerability in my defense. Trent would spin a narrative. He would tell his CEO that the catering company experienced an emergency. He would apologize, order pizzas, and salvage his reputation. He would still expect his $12,500 reimbursement, and he would still expect me to take the fall if an auditor ever knocked on his door. I had to return to the dining room. I had to face the man who controlled my hospital budget. I had to personally detonate Trent's career in front of his superiors, ensuring the liability fell squarely onto the shoulders of the man who forged the documents. I turned away from the van. I walked back toward the mudroom entrance. The kitchen was waiting. And inside that kitchen, sitting on my prep table, was the final piece of equipment I needed to retrieve before I faced the dining room. I stepped back over the threshold of the mudroom and pushed the heavy wooden door shut. The deadbolt engaged with a solid metallic chunk, sealing the freezing wind outside. The kitchen felt unnervingly calm. Evelyn and Jessica were gone. They had retreated toward the dining room, likely scrambling to intercept Trent and manage the rising impatience of the executives. The commercial ovens were still radiating intense heat, but the air was shifting. The smell of the roasted beef and the red wine reduction was dissipating, replaced by the sterile scent of stainless steel cleaner and cold ceramic. I walked to the center island. The granite surface was bare, save for one item resting near the edge: my black canvas knife roll. I unrolled the heavy fabric, exposing the individual compartments. I reached for my grandmother's 8-inch Wusthof chef knife resting on the cutting board. I picked it up by the black synthetic handle. I grabbed a clean, dry linen towel and pinched it around the spine of the blade. I wiped the high-carbon steel in long, deliberate strokes. I removed the invisible residue of the service, the rendered fat, the fine dusting of flour. The metal gleamed under the recessed ceiling lights, reflecting a distorted silver version of the empty kitchen. When my grandmother Helen bought me this blade, I was a teenager washing dishes in a local diner, desperate for a way out of Evelyn's house. Helen saw the quiet discipline I brought to my work. She saw the potential for a career built on precision. Evelyn saw a maid. Helen saw an executive chef. I slid the clean blade into its designated slot in the canvas roll. I reached for my plating tweezers next. The long, slender metal prongs I used to arrange delicate microgreens and fragile garnishes. I wiped them down and tucked them away. I collected my digital instant read meat thermometers, coiling the wire probes carefully to prevent crimping. I secured my heavy-duty kitchen shears. I rolled the canvas tight, wrapping the thick leather straps around the bundle and buckled them securely. The physical act of packing my tools was a profound psychological shift. In a commercial kitchen, when a chef packs their knife roll before the end of service, it signifies a permanent exit. It means the environment has become untenable, the management incompetent, or the fundamental contract broken. You do not leave your knives behind. You take your skill, your dignity, and your tools, and you walk away. I placed the secured knife roll next to the sink. I reached around to the small of my back and untied the knot securing my apron. I pulled the heavy white cotton fabric over my head. The material was stained with the battle scars of the evening. A streak of dark pan gravy near the hem, a dusting of white pastry flour across the chest, a faint smudge of blackberry coulis near the pocket. I laid the apron flat on the granite island. I folded the right side to the middle, then the left, creating a clean, vertical rectangle. I folded it in half horizontally. I smoothed the fabric down, pressing the creases sharp with the flat of my palms. I centered the folded apron on the island. It sat there, under the bright lights, a stark, undeniable symbol of my resignation. I was no longer the family servant. I was clocking out. I walked to the hall closet. I pulled my heavy winter parka from the hanger. I slipped my arms into the insulated sleeves and zipped it up to my chin. I pulled my thick leather gloves from the pockets and laid them on the counter next to my knife roll. The audio pacing of the house shifted. The kitchen was completely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator compressor. But from beyond the swinging doors, the ambient noise of the dining room was amplifying. The low murmur of polite corporate chatter had fractured. I could hear the scrape of wooden chairs pushing back against the hardwood floor. I heard the sharp clink of an empty crystal glass hitting the mahogany table. 50 hungry, expectant guests were beginning to realize the rhythm of the evening had stalled. The seamless transition between courses had failed. "Trent, what is the delay?" The voice belonged to Richard Sterling. It cut through the ambient noise of the dining room with the casual, devastating authority of a man who was used to immediate compliance. His tone was not angry, but it was edged with genuine curiosity. He was accustomed to highly orchestrated events. He recognized a systemic failure when he saw one. Trent's response was a nervous, rapid-fire stammer. "Just a minor logistical hiccup in the kitchen, Richard. The catering staff is prepping the final plating now. I will go check on their progress. My apologies." I heard Trent's heavy footsteps marching rapidly down the hallway toward the kitchen. The sound was loud, aggressive, fueled by panic and public humiliation. I did not hide. I did not retreat to the mudroom. I stood perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, wearing my winter parka over my hospital uniform. I rested my hand on the sleek black leather folio sitting on the counter. Inside that folio rested the $12,500 invoice, the photograph of the forged expense report, and the legal eviction notice drafted by Attorney Davis. The swinging door burst open. Trent stormed into the kitchen. His face was a mottled crimson. He was sweating heavily, his tailored suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie slightly askew. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting from the empty prep tables to the locked pantry door, and finally landing on the pristine, empty countertops. His brain struggled to process the visual data. The smell of the food was overpowering, but the physical reality of the feast was gone. "Where is it?" Trent demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, ragged hiss. He stepped toward me, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Where is the main course, Gabriella? What did you do?" I picked up the black leather folio. The smooth material felt cold against my palm. "The food is secured in the transport van," I said. My voice was calm, measuring out the words with absolute precision. Trent stared at me. He looked at my heavy winter coat, then at the folded, stained apron sitting on the island. The reality of his situation crashed into him. "You loaded the food into a van," he repeated the words, stumbling out of his mouth. "Bring it back. Bring it back right now." "Richard is sitting 10 feet away. If you do not serve that beef, I am going to lose this account." "You already lost the account," I said, "and you are about to lose a great deal more." "Unlock the door," Trent yelled, pointing a trembling finger toward the mudroom. "I am not playing games with you. Go outside, get the food, and plate it." "No." The single syllable stopped him. He opened his mouth to shout again, but the sound died in his throat. He recognized the shift in my posture. He realized I was not experiencing a sudden panic attack. I was executing a deliberate strategy. I tapped the black leather folio against the granite counter. "You forwarded a catering invoice to your accounting department this afternoon," I said, my voice cutting through his panic. "You requested a corporate reimbursement for $12,500. You documented your financial obligation to me." Trent's face went pale. The crimson flush drained away, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. "How do you know about that?" "I know everything, Trent. And because you forwarded that document, my catering service operates under standard commercial contract rules. I require immediate payment before the final service is rendered." I unzipped the top of the folio. I pulled out a small white plastic square, a mobile credit card reader. I plugged the small device into the charging port of my smartphone. The reader chimed a bright green light illuminating the plastic casing. "You have your corporate American Express card in your wallet." I continued holding the phone out toward him. "Swipe the card. Pay the $12,500 invoice you legally accepted. If the transaction clears, I will retrieve the hot boxes and you can serve your guests. If you refuse, I am walking out the front door and you can explain the catering failure to Richard Sterling yourself." Trent stared at the glowing green light of the card reader. He was trapped in a financial vice of his own making. Trent stared at the small plastic card reader extending from the base of my smartphone. The green indicator light pulsed in the dim kitchen, a rhythmic electronic heartbeat illuminating the exact boundaries of the trap I had built for him. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored shirt. He raised his eyes from the device to my face. The sheer audacity of the situation paralyzed him. "You are extorting me," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You are trying to blackmail me in the middle of a corporate event. Extortion implies a threat to reveal a secret unless a demand is met." I replied, my voice clinical and detached. "I am not threatening you. I am enforcing a commercial contract. You submitted a formal invoice to your accounting department this afternoon. You generated the paperwork. I am simply collecting the debt you documented." He dragged a shaking hand through his hair, destroying the meticulous styling. "I cannot run $12,000 on the corporate card right now. Accounting flagged my monthly limit last week. The transaction will decline. You know that. You are doing this on purpose." I did know that. I had managed enough corporate vendor accounts to understand the limits placed on regional managers. He never intended to pay the invoice. He intended to submit the paperwork, request a direct cash reimbursement to his personal checking account, and pocket the funds entirely. My demand for immediate electronic payment was a deliberate, impossible hurdle. "Then the catering contract is terminated," I said, unplugging the card reader from my phone and sliding it back into the black leather folio. I turned away from him. I picked up my heavy canvas knife roll and tucked it securely under my left arm. I adjusted the collar of my winter parka. Trent lunged forward, grabbing my shoulder with a forceful, desperate grip. "You are not leaving. You are going to walk out to that van, bring the food inside, and serve my guests. I am not losing my job because you decided to play accountant." I looked down at his hand gripping my jacket. I did not struggle. I did not attempt to pull away. I simply turned my head and fixed my gaze directly onto his eyes. In my hospital kitchen, I manage a staff of 20 individuals. Some are ex-convicts working through rehabilitation programs. Some are hardened culinary veterans. I do not maintain authority by shouting or engaging in physical altercations. I maintain authority through absolute, unyielding presence. "Remove your hand," I said. The tone was quiet, but it carried the density of cold iron. Trent hesitated, his fingers tightening briefly before his internal survival instincts overrode his panic. He released his grip and stepped back, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "I am walking into the dining room," I informed him, adjusting the folio under my arm. "I am going to formally announce my departure. You can follow me or you can hide in here. The choice is yours." I did not wait for his response. I pushed past him, walked toward the swinging wooden doors, and placed my palm flat against the brass push plate. I stepped into the dining room. The transition from the stark fluorescent lighting of the kitchen to the warm ambient glow of the chandelier was jarring. The room was loud, filled with the impatient murmur of 50 corporate executives waiting for a main course that was never going to arrive. The moment I crossed the threshold, the visual anomaly of my presence registered with the guests seated nearest the door. The conversation began to fracture. A ripple of silence spread down the length of the massive mahogany table. I was not wearing a crisp white server uniform. I was not pushing a silver cart. I was fully dressed in a heavy insulated winter parka, carrying a canvas tool roll and a black leather folio. I looked exactly like someone who was leaving the building and never coming back. Jessica was standing near the sideboard holding a crystal water pitcher. She turned, saw my winter coat, and nearly dropped the heavy glass vessel. Her perfectly curated smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure horror. Evelyn was seated near the middle of the table, attempting to engage a regional director in polite conversation. She caught the sudden silence, turned her head, and gasped audibly. I ignored them both. I walked with measured, deliberate steps down the length of the room. The thick rubber soles of my boots made no sound against the Persian rug, but the silence of the executives amplified my approach. I bypassed the logistics managers. I bypassed the vice presidents. I stopped at the head of the table. Richard Sterling sat in a high-backed leather chair. His posture was relaxed, exuding the comfortable authority of a man entirely secure in his position. He was swirling a shallow measure of red wine in his glass, observing my approach with an expression of mild curiosity. "Mr. Sterling," I said, projecting my voice clearly so it carried down the entire length of the table, "it is a pleasure to see you outside the hospital board meetings." Sterling paused, his hand freezing mid-swirl. He looked at my face, squinting slightly in the dim candlelight. He noted the dark circles under my eyes, the flour dusting the hem of my slacks beneath my coat, and the heavy canvas knife roll tucked under my arm. Recognition sparked in his eyes, bright and immediate. He set his wineglass down on the table. "Chef Wright," Sterling said, his voice registering genuine surprise. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms against the mahogany surface. I had no idea Trent retained the hospital's executive chef for this event. "Your dietary budget presentation last quarter was exceptional. Are you moonlighting in private catering?" The illusion shattered instantly. The entire foundation of Trent's carefully constructed narrative collapsed under the weight of Sterling's recognition. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the far end of the room. Trent had followed me out of the kitchen. He was standing near the swinging doors, his face the color of wet ash. He watched his CEO validate my professional identity, destroying the myth of the cheap, invisible in-house cook. "I am not moonlighting, Mr. Sterling," I replied, keeping my focus locked on the chairman. "I was retained to execute the menu for this evening's corporate event. Unfortunately, the logistics of the service have broken down. I am unable to proceed." Sterling frowned, the warmth of his recognition hardening into executive scrutiny. "Broken down? In what capacity? The appetizers were outstanding. We've been waiting for the main course." I turned slowly toward the opposite end of the room. I located Trent, standing paralyzed near the kitchen doors. I raised the black leather folio, holding it out in his direction. "You will have to ask your regional manager about the delay," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "I submitted the invoice for the catering service this afternoon. The payment terms required electronic clearance prior to the final plating. The client was unable to authorize the transaction. My contract is therefore terminated." I turned back to Sterling. I offered him a brief, respectful nod. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Sterling. The food is secure, but the service is concluded. I am clocking out." The dining room erupted into a chaotic symphony of overlapping reactions. Several executives began murmuring in low, aggressive tones. A vice president near the center of the table stood up, demanding an explanation. Jessica abandoned her water pitcher and rushed toward Trent, her high heels clattering against the floorboards. Sterling did not join the chaos. He sat perfectly still in his leather chair. He looked at me, registering the heavy winter coat and the packed knife roll. Then he looked down the length of the table at Trent. Sterling's expression was no longer curious. It was lethal. He possessed decades of corporate experience. He recognized the distinct scent of financial irregularity. He understood that an executive chef from his own hospital network would not publicly terminate a massive catering contract in front of a board member without profound, documented justification. Trent Sterling said, he did not yell, but his voice cut through the ambient noise of the room like a scalpel. "Come here." Trent flinched. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit, an excuse, a lifeline. He found nothing but the accusing stares of 50 colleagues. He dragged his feet across the rug, walking the gauntlet of the dining room until he reached the head of the table. He stood next to me, sweating profusely, avoiding eye contact with his CEO. I turned to Trent and extended the black leather folio. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "The formal invoice for my services is inside," I stated clearly, along with the documentation confirming the debt. "Keep it for your records." Trent did not raise his hands. He stood paralyzed. I stepped closer, pressing the thick leather folder firmly against his chest, forcing him to reflexively grab it to prevent it from falling to the floor. "Good night, Trent," I said. I turned my back on him. I turned my back on the 50 stranded executives, the empty mahogany table, and the shattered illusion of my brother-in-law's corporate ascendancy. I began the long walk toward the front entryway, but before I reached the foyer, the final obstacle of the evening materialized. Evelyn intercepted me stepping out from the shadows of the hallway, her face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate fury. The financial trap had sprung, but the battle for the ground we were standing on was about to begin. Evelyn blocked the archway leading to the front foyer. Her posture was rigid, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles in her neck stood out in sharp relief. She did not care about the 50 corporate guests watching us from the dining table. She only cared that her carefully constructed illusion of wealth and control was disintegrating. She stepped into my path, forcing me to halt. "You are not leaving this house," Evelyn hissed, keeping her voice low but laced with venom. "You are going to turn around, walk out to that van, and bring the food inside. If you walk out that door, you are never stepping foot in this property again. You will be on the street tomorrow morning." I looked at my mother. I felt a brief, hollow echo of the fear that threat used to inspire. It was gone, now replaced by the quiet certainty of the heavy documents resting in my coat pocket. I opened my mouth to deliver the final blow regarding the property deed, but a voice from the dining room interrupted the confrontation. "Open the folder, Trent." The command sliced through the tense silence of the room. It was Richard Sterling. I turned my head. Sterling was no longer sitting relaxed in his high-backed leather chair. He was leaning forward, his hands resting flat on the mahogany table. His eyes were locked onto the black leather folio I had shoved into Trent's chest moments earlier. Trent was still standing frozen at the end of the table. He gripped the leather folder with both hands, knuckles turning white under the strain. He looked like a man standing on a trap door, waiting for the lever to pull. "Richard, it is nothing," Trent stammered, offering a weak, trembling smile. "Just a minor vendor dispute, a misunderstanding over the delivery schedule. I will handle it. You told me the catering firm was prepping the final plating," Sterling noted, his tone measuring out the contradiction. "Chef Wright just stated her contract is terminated due to lack of payment. Open the folder." Trent swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward Jessica, who was standing paralyzed near the sideboard. She offered no rescue. She was staring at the black folio as if it were a bomb. With shaking fingers, Trent unzipped the top edge of the leather case. He flipped the cover open. The crisp, white pages of the legal documents contrasted sharply against the black interior. The top sheet was the catering invoice, printed on heavy stock paper, detailing the exact costs of the prime beef, the specialty ingredients, and the premium executive chef labor rate. The total at the bottom was bold and undeniable, $12,500. But it was the second document that drained the last remaining color from Trent's face. It was the high-resolution photograph I had taken in the kitchen that morning. The image clearly displayed Trent's glowing laptop screen, the corporate logistics logo at the top of the spreadsheet, the phantom vendor name Premier Catering Service, the matching $12,500 reimbursement request, and resting right next to the keyboard in the photograph, his silver corporate American Express card. Trent stared at the photograph. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed to produce a sound. He looked up, his eyes finding mine across the room. The arrogance that defined his entire personality was gone, replaced by the raw, suffocating panic of a man who realized he was caught in a federal crime. "You," Trent whispered, his voice cracking. "The food." "The food is in my van," I replied, my voice echoing clearly across the silent dining room. I stepped away from Evelyn, moving back toward the edge of the long table. "You forwarded a fraudulent catering invoice to your accounting department this morning, Trent. You requested a direct cash reimbursement for a meal you intended to force me to finance and cook for free. Therefore, I am requiring immediate payment before finalizing service." I unzipped the side pocket of my winter parka. I withdrew the small white plastic mobile card reader. I plugged the device into the charging port of my smartphone. A bright green indicator light illuminated the plastic casing, blinking steadily in the dim room. "You can use that corporate American Express card," I said, holding the device up. "The one sitting in your wallet. The one captured in the photograph you are holding. Swipe the card, clear the balance, and I will serve your guests." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the seated executives. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together in the minds of 50 highly educated business professionals. They realized they were not witnessing a simple vendor dispute. They were witnessing an active embezzlement scheme being dismantled in real time. Richard Sterling stood up. He did not rush. He rose from his chair with the deliberate, heavy grace of a man who commanded thousands of employees. He buttoned the center button of his suit jacket. He walked slowly down the length of the mahogany table. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Sterling stopped in front of Trent. The regional manager was shivering, his gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards. "Hand me the file," Sterling said. Trent did not protest. His fingers uncurled, allowing the black leather folio to slip from his grasp. Sterling caught it. The CEO looked at the top page. He read the itemized catering invoice. He flipped the page and stared at the photograph of the laptop screen. He analyzed the digital evidence for 10 seconds. He noted the corporate logo on the spreadsheet. He noted the vendor name. He noted the exact dollar amount matching the invoice. Sterling closed the folio. He looked at Trent. The executive scrutiny in his eyes was absolute and devoid of any compassion. "You submitted a reimbursement request for $12,500 this afternoon," Sterling stated. He was not asking a question. He was establishing the timeline of the termination. "You directed those funds to be paid to a phantom vendor intending to intercept the corporate wire transfer. You planned to steal from this company while exploiting the executive chef of our own hospital network to cover your tracks." "Richard, please," Trent begged, his voice a pathetic, reedy whine. He held his hands up, palms facing outward in a gesture of surrender. "It was an accounting error. I was going to adjust the ledger on Monday. I wanted to impress the board. I overextended my personal finances. I can fix this." "There is nothing to fix," Sterling replied. His voice was cold, stripped of any professional courtesy. "Corporate theft is a zero-tolerance offense. Using an employee of our allied medical network as an unwitting accomplice to federal wire fraud is an astonishing display of sheer stupidity." Jessica let out a sharp, strangled sob from the corner of the room. Trent squeezed his eyes shut, anticipating the blow. "You are terminated effective immediately," Sterling announced. The words landed like heavy stones on the mahogany table. "Your regional authority is revoked. You will not contact your district managers. You will not access the corporate servers. You will surrender your company phone and your corporate credit card to me right now." Trent stood, paralyzed. The reality of the execution stripped away his motor functions. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of superior wealth and untouchable corporate power. He had abused his family's stolen my labor and belittled my profession to maintain that image. Now he was being publicly stripped of his title in the middle of a dining room he falsely claimed to own. "The card and the phone," Trent Sterling repeated, extending his right hand. Trent reached into his suit jacket. His hands shook violently as he extracted his smartphone. He pulled his leather wallet from his back pocket, retrieved the silver corporate card, and placed both items into Sterling's waiting palm. Sterling slipped the devices into his own pocket. He turned to the 50 executives seated around the table. "This dinner is concluded," Sterling addressed his staff. "We will reconvene at the downtown hotel lounge. The company will cover the bar tab. Please gather your coats." Chairs scraped rapidly against the floorboards. The executives stood up in unison, eager to escape the toxic atmosphere of the house. They moved swiftly toward the front hallway, avoiding eye contact with Trent and Jessica. They filed past me, offering brief, respectful nods as they headed for the door. Sterling turned back to me. He held the black leather folio in his hand. "Chef Wright," he said, his tone shifting from lethal corporate executioner to professional colleague. You executed a difficult maneuver tonight with remarkable precision. I appreciate your integrity in bringing this matter to light before corporate funds were dispersed. I protect my kitchen, Mr. Sterling, I replied, and I protect my professional credentials. You did both, he agreed. He handed the folio back to me. I assume you have a plan for the inventory currently sitting in your transport van? I do. Good, Sterling offered a brief, firm nod. He walked past Evelyn, who was pressed flat against the hallway wall, and exited the house, following his executives into the freezing North Dakota night. The front door closed, leaving the house trapped in a sudden, echoing vacuum of silence. Trent collapsed into a dining chair, burying his face in his hands. Jessica rushed to his side, her emerald gown sweeping across the floor, demanding to know how they were going to survive without his salary. The corporate threat was neutralized. My career was secure. But the domestic war was not over. Evelyn pushed herself away from the wall. She marched back into the dining room, her eyes burning with a furious, displaced rage. Her golden son-in-law was ruined, her social standing was annihilated, and she needed a target. She turned her sights on me, ready to execute her final, desperate threat of eviction. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, severing the last connection to the corporate executives. The silence left behind was thick, suffocating, and absolute. The dining room, previously humming with the energy of 50 powerful people, now resembled a shipwreck. Empty crystal wine glasses caught the light of the chandelier. The mahogany table stretched out vast and barren, stripped of the feast it was meant to hold. Trent was slumped in a high-backed chair at the head of the table. His elbows rested on his knees, his face buried deep in his hands. The tailored jacket he wore now looked absurd, a costume for a role he no longer possessed. Jessica hovered over him, her emerald silk gown rustling against the rug. She was gripping his shoulder, firing rapid, frantic questions about severance packages and emergency savings accounts. He did not answer her. He just stared at the floorboards, paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his career. Evelyn watched the collapse of her golden son-in-law from the archway. The illusion she had fiercely protected for years, the image of a wealthy, untouchable family, had detonated in her living room. The humiliation was total. And because Evelyn lacked the capacity for self-reflection, her brain immediately sought a scapegoat. She turned toward me. The shock on her face curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched across the dining room, her sensible pumps hitting the hardwood with heavy, aggressive strikes. She stopped 3 feet away from me. The air between us cracked with tension. "You ruined everything," Evelyn screamed. Her voice was harsh, jagged, completely abandoning the polished tone she used for her social circle. "You humiliated this family. You destroyed Trent's career over a petty grudge about groceries. You vindictive, ungrateful child." I stood perfectly still in my winter parka. I did not retreat. I held the black leather folio securely at my side. I did not force Trent to commit federal wire fraud. I did not submit a forged invoice. I simply refused to be his accomplice. "You set him up," Jessica shrieked, turning away from her husband. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "You knew the CEO was coming. You planned this whole spectacle just to embarrass us, because you are jealous. You are just a cook, Gabriella. You have always been jealous of what we have. What you have," I stated calmly, "is an unemployed husband facing potential corporate litigation." Evelyn stepped closer, invading my physical space. She raised her hand, her index finger jabbing the air inches from my face. She was preparing to deploy the ultimate weapon in her arsenal, the threat she had wielded successfully for 7 years to maintain my submission. "You are done," Evelyn hissed, her eyes wild with malice. "You are packing your bags tonight. I am going to the courthouse first thing tomorrow morning. I am filing the eviction paperwork. I am removing you from my house. You will be out on the street in the snow, and I will make sure you do not take a single piece of furniture with you." I looked at my mother's face. I studied the absolute certainty in her expression. She truly believed she held the power to destroy my housing security. She believed her manufactured authority was impenetrable. I reached my right hand into the deep zippered pocket of my winter parka. My fingers brushed against the heavy manila envelope I had secured there hours earlier. The envelope containing the legal architecture drafted by Attorney Davis. "You are going to the courthouse," I said, pulling the thick envelope from my pocket. "Tomorrow morning," Evelyn confirmed, her chin lifting in a gesture of absolute triumph. "You are finished here." I held the envelope out toward her. "You will save yourself a trip. The filing is already complete." Evelyn frowned, her eyes darting from my face to the extended envelope. She did not reach for it. She viewed it with deep suspicion, sensing a shift in the current, but unable to comprehend the direction. "What is that?" she demanded. "Read it," I said, stepping forward and pressing the heavy paper stock against her hand. Evelyn reflexively grabbed the envelope. She tore open the flap, her movements jerky and impatient. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. The top page was the certified, notarized revocation of the power of attorney. The document my grandmother Helen had executed 3 weeks before her death, formally stripping Evelyn of all legal and financial control over the estate. Evelyn's eyes scanned the header. The color drained from her face. Her lips parted slightly as she recognized her mother's signature at the bottom of the page, flanked by the blue ink of the notary seal. She flipped to the second page. It was the addendum dissolving the life estate, citing her gross financial mismanagement. The legal language explicitly revoked her right to reside on the property indefinitely. Her hands began to tremble. The heavy paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. She flipped to the third page. It was the updated deed registration, filed electronically with the county clerk that very afternoon by Martin Davis. The document confirmed the transfer of the property from the trust directly into my name. It established me as the sole, undisputed legal owner of the house, the land, and every fixture attached to it. "You cannot evict the owner, Mom," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a verdict. Evelyn stared at the deed. She read my name printed in bold black ink. She read the county clerk's electronic filing stamp. The legal reality of her situation crushed the remaining breath from her lungs. She had spent 7 years parading a voided document using an empty threat to enslave me. She believed I would never dare to investigate the archives. She believed my fear of homelessness would override my common sense. She had severely miscalculated. "This is impossible," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked up, her eyes wide with a frantic, searching desperation. "Helen promised me a life estate. I have the papers. I have the authority." "You had a draft," I corrected her. "Helen revoked it when she realized you were draining the accounts. She left the property to me. You have been squatting in my house for 7 years. You have been demanding rent in the form of labor for a property you do not own. You have been threatening to evict me from my own home." Jessica stepped away from Trent. She moved toward Evelyn, peering over her mother's shoulder to read the documents. She saw the deed. She saw my name. The arrogance drained from her features, replaced by a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. "Mom," Jessica asked, her voice shaking, "what does that mean? Does she own the house?" Evelyn did not answer. She could not force the admission past her lips. She simply stared at the papers, her hands trembling violently. I reached out and flipped to the final document in the stack Evelyn was holding. It was a formal 30-day notice to quit, the standard legal eviction notice drafted by Davis & Associates. It clearly named Evelyn, Jessica, and Trent as unauthorized occupants of the property. "I am giving you 30 days to vacate my property," I announced, addressing all 3 of them. I kept my posture rigid, anchoring my authority in the center of my dining room. "You will pack your belongings, you will arrange your own moving logistics, and you will surrender your keys. If you remain on the premises after the 30th day, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you for trespassing." Trent slowly lifted his head from his hands. He looked at the eviction notice, then looked at his wife, and finally looked at me. The total inversion of power was complete. He had lost his lucrative corporate job, his regional authority, and his reputation. Now he was losing his housing. He was staring down the barrel of severe financial ruin, and he had absolutely no leverage left to negotiate. "Gabriella, please," Jessica started, her voice hitching into a desperate sob. She abandoned the furious entitlement she had weaponized just moments prior. She adopted the tone of a frightened child. "Trent just lost his job. We do not have the savings to put down a deposit on a new place right now. You cannot throw us out in the middle of winter. We are family." I looked at my sister. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner I ate over the sink. I thought about the chest freezer she deliberately unplugged. I thought about the $400 of meat she attempted to rot just to break my professional composure. "You should have considered the winter weather before you demanded I finance your husband's corporate fraud," I said. "Consider this your formal legal notice." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for Evelyn to argue. I did not wait for Trent to beg. I did not engage in the emotional theatrics they desperately wanted to initiate. You do not negotiate with evicted tenants. You serve the papers and you walk away. I walked out of the dining room. I crossed the front foyer, my heavy winter boots sounding loud against the hardwood floor. I reached the heavy oak front door. I grabbed the brass handle, pulled it open, and stepped out onto the front porch. The freezing North Dakota wind hit my face sharp and bracing. The snow was still falling, covering the driveway and the lawn in a pristine, untouched layer of white. I walked down the concrete steps toward my rented transit van idling in the driveway, the exhaust plumed in the dark. I unlocked the driver's side door and climbed into the cab. The heater blasted warm air against my frozen cheeks. I shifted the vehicle into drive, the tires crunching against the fresh snow. I pulled out of the driveway, leaving the house behind me. My family was trapped inside, standing in silence, holding the legal proof of their own destruction. They were finally forced to confront the reality of their actions without a scapegoat to absorb the damage. I merged onto the empty stretch of Interstate 94. The operation was a complete success. I had protected my career, I had secured my property, and I had neutralized my abusers. But the night was not over. The heavy commercial Cambro boxes secured in the back of my van were still radiating intense heat. I had 50 portions of perfectly rested 5-star beef tenderloin in my possession, and I knew exactly where I was going to serve them. The digital clock on the dashboard of the transit van read 8:45. Interstate 94 was a dark, wind-swept corridor, but the roads leading into the city center were heavily salted and clear. I steered the heavy vehicle off the highway and navigated toward the sprawling, illuminated campus of the regional hospital network. I bypassed the main visitor entrance and drove around to the rear loading docks. The service bays were quiet, bathed in the harsh yellow glare of security spotlights. I parked the van, killed the engine, and grabbed my security badge. I swiped my credentials at the service door, the heavy metal barrier unsealed with a hydraulic hiss. I walked to the dietary department, grabbed a flatbed utility cart, and rolled it out to the driveway. Working a commercial kitchen means understanding the physical toll of a 12-hour shift. Working the medical night shift means enduring that toll while holding human lives in the balance. The nurses, trauma, surgeons, and orderlies operating on the floors above me functioned on vending machine coffee, stale granola bars, and sheer adrenaline. They spent holidays away from their families, monitoring telemetry screens and changing IV bags. I opened the rear doors of the transit van. The commercial Cambro hotboxes were still radiating a steady, contained heat. I hoisted the heavy carriers onto the flatbed cart, secured them, and pushed the payload inside the building. I bypassed my own dark kitchen and navigated the service elevators up to the 3rd floor, the intensive care unit. The corridors were lined with sterile white tiles and humming machinery. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air. I rolled the cart into the primary staff break room. The space was utilitarian, furnished with plastic chairs, a humming refrigerator, and a whiteboard covered in scheduling notes. Sarah, the charge nurse for the ICU, was sitting at a small table, charting patient vitals on a tablet. She looked up. Her scrubs were wrinkled. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She had been on her feet since 6 o'clock that evening. She looked at my winter parka, then at the towering dark gray insulated boxes on the cart. "Chef Wright," Sarah said, her voice registering exhausted confusion. "The cafeteria closed 3 hours ago. Did dietary authorize a late delivery?" "Dietary is off the clock." "Sarah," I replied, unlatching the first Cambro unit, "this is a private donation." I pulled the heavy door open. A thick cloud of steam rolled out into the sterile break room, carrying the profound savory aroma of roasted garlic thyme and seared beef. Sarah stood up her tablet, forgotten on the table. The smell was an alien presence in the hospital ward. It smelled like warmth, luxury, and care. I retrieved a clean cutting board and a slicing knife from the cart. I pulled out the first baking sheet. 6 pristine beef Wellingtons rested on the metal surface. The puff pastry was baked to a flawless golden brown. I positioned the blade over the center of the first pastry. I pressed down. The crisp crust fractured with a sharp, satisfying crunch. The knife slid through the mushroom duxelle, the layer of prosciutto, and the tender center-cut beef. I separated the halves. The meat was a perfect, uniform, medium rare, glistening with retained juices. "Call the floor," I instructed, placing the portions onto heavy ceramic plates I had brought from the kitchen below. "Tell the trauma rotation the residents and the orderlies to rotate through the break room. I have 50 portions of center-cut tenderloin and roasted winter vegetables. Nobody eats from the vending machines tonight." Sarah stared at the plated food. Her eyes welled with sudden, unprompted tears. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. She reached for the internal intercom phone mounted on the wall. Over the next 2 hours, the break room transformed. Medical professionals filtered in, their faces lined with the profound fatigue of their profession. They accepted the plates with quiet reverence. They sat in the plastic chairs, eating a 5-star meal, savoring the rich reduction sauce and the tender root vegetables. I watched them eat. I watched a resident close his eyes as he tasted the pastry. I watched an orderly smile for the first time all night. These individuals did not demand my labor. They did not insult my ingredients or belittle my profession. They performed grueling, thankless work to keep strangers alive, and they received my culinary skill as a gift. I realized then that the concept of family extends far beyond biological proximity. Family is defined by mutual respect. It is defined by the recognition of shared effort. I had spent years attempting to feed a void inside a house that resented me. Tonight, I fed my real team. I turned a stolen, fraudulent meal into a massive morale victory for the people who actually deserved it. The 30 days that followed that night operated like a slow, crushing vice on the occupants of my house. I remained on the property, moving through the rooms like a silent architect, observing a controlled demolition. I did not engage in arguments. I communicated exclusively through Attorney Davis, funneling all logistical inquiries regarding their departure through his Fargo office. Trent was unemployable. Richard Sterling had not just fired him, he had blacklisted him across the Midwestern logistics sector. Word of corporate theft travels rapidly in executive circles. Without his bloated salary, Trent could not secure a luxury lease. He and Jessica were forced to sign a contract for a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of the city. The pressure of their financial ruin fractured their marriage. The house echoed with their bitter, venomous arguments. Jessica blamed Trent for his sheer stupidity. Trent blamed Jessica for demanding an elevated lifestyle he could not afford. Evelyn watched her golden son-in-law degrade into a liability. She tried to assert her dominance, attempting to manipulate me into letting her stay in the guest room. She tried crying. She tried leveraging guilt. She reminded me of my childhood, of the sacrifices she claimed she made. I looked at her and quoted the exact phrase she used on Thanksgiving Day. "You are living under this roof without paying a mortgage," I told her. "You use the utilities, find an apartment." Without me serving as the shared scapegoat, their toxic dynamic turned inward. They devoured each other. They packed their belongings in a state of hostile silence. On the 30th day, a discount rental truck idled in the driveway. It was not a professional moving service. They could not afford one. Trent hauled cardboard boxes through the snow, his posture stooped and defeated. Jessica carried her designer clothes in plastic garbage bags. Evelyn supervised, her face drawn and hollow, stripped of the arrogance that had defined her existence. I stood on the front porch and watched the rental truck pull out of the driveway. The exhaust plumed in the freezing air. The taillights flickered red, turning the corner at the end of the street, and disappeared. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I called a local locksmith. An hour later, the heavy brass cylinders on the front and back doors were replaced. The deadbolts engaged with a sharp, heavy click. I held the new, uncut silver keys in my palm. I walked through the empty rooms of the house. The furniture was rearranged, the spaces stripped of Evelyn's decorative clutter and Jessica's scattered belongings. The silence was profound. It did not feel lonely. It felt expansive. In geological surveys, there is a term called overburden. It describes the heavy, worthless layer of soil and rock resting on top of a valuable mineral formation. To reach the asset, you must strip away the overburden. You must dig through the dirt to uncover the core. For 34 years, my mother, my sister, and her husband had acted as my overburden. They pressed down on my ambitions, suffocating my professional identity, burying my worth under their endless demands and manufactured crises. Walking through the quiet hallway, feeling the hardwood floor solid beneath my boots, I realized the dirt was finally gone. The house belonged to me. The kitchen belonged to me. 2 weeks later, I hosted a dinner party. I prepared a menu of handmade agnolotti, roasted seasonal squash, and a delicate citrus crudo. The ingredients were precise, the execution flawless. I did not set the table for 30 ungrateful relatives. I set the table for 6. Attorney Martin Davis drove in from Fargo. Sarah, the charge nurse from the intensive care unit, arrived wearing a comfortable sweater, looking rested for the first time in months. 4 of my most trusted sous chefs and dietary managers from the hospital filled the remaining seats. The dining room was warm. The crystal glasses caught the light of the chandelier. The conversation flowed easy and genuine, punctuated by genuine laughter and professional respect. I did not eat a cold dinner roll while standing over the kitchen sink. I walked out of the kitchen carrying the final serving platter. I set it down in the center of the mahogany table. I pulled out the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, the chair Trent used to occupy, the seat of authority. I sat down. I poured myself a glass of vintage Bordeaux. I looked at the people gathered around my table, people who respected my skill, valued my time, and paid their debts. If you are listening to this and you are currently standing in a hot kitchen, cooking a meal for people who view your labor as an expectation rather than a gift, remember the mechanics of power. Biology provides them with proximity. You provide them with power. They can only banish you to the kitchen if you agree to walk through the swinging doors. They can only consume your identity if you plate it and serve it to them. You have the right to check the foundation of the house you are standing in. You have the right to demand payment for your sweat. You have the right to pack your knives, lock the pantry, and walk out into the cold. Stop cooking for people who refuse to save you a seat. Build your own table and let them starve. Drop a comment below if you have ever reclaimed your own space, and hit subscribe for more stories. Stay sharp.